We've been thinking about a loose reconstruction of Green's argument, which has some implications for ethics. You remember that the conclusion of this argument is that not justified inferentially premises concerning particular moral scenarios cannot be used in those ethical arguments where the aim is to gain knowledge concerning ethical truths or principles. Now, I actually just extended the conclusion in the section on Rawls' method of reflective equilibrium. I'm not going to repeat the argument here, but I am going to rely on the extension. So it turns out that the argument can be generalised to include not just premises about particular moral scenarios, but also premises about principles where there's any possibility of debate about those principles, and the premises are not justified inferentially. So that's a nice generalisation. Now here's the thing. There is a sense in which, if this argument is right, discoveries in moral psychology have no consequences whatsoever for ethics. So think back to Foote and Thompson, whose arguments appeared to draw on premises about why people make certain judgments. What this conclusion suggests is that why people make certain judgments is not a good basis for an argument about discovering an ethical truth, at least not one that isn't already codified in the fast processes, and therefore it seems little reason to want to articulate it, little to be gained from articulating it apart from to learn about the moral psychology itself. So there is a sense in which, if we accept this principle, we should think, look, moral psychology just doesn't have consequences for ethics. This is not the way to do ethics, by making discoveries about moral psychology, any more than you would expect to find out things about the physical world by looking at physical cognition. Both cases, that turns out to be a mistake. On the other hand, you can see from the conclusion of the argument, of course, that it does have some conclusions for particular ethical arguments. It says, look, particular ethical arguments are of a kind which just can't work. The sort that Foote and Thompson, as I interpret them, are arguing. They are arguments which just can't work. All right. And also there's a problem with some of Cam's arguments as well. So it looks like some of those arguments can't work either. Let's try and go a bit further though. So there's two sorts of things we might try to get out of this. One thing that we might try to get out of this is some support for a particular moral theory, and in this case it will be some variety of consequentialism. Or alternatively, we might try to at least remove some objections to consequentialism. That would be the negative part. Let's look at the more ambitious positive part first. This is not one of Green's arguments, but I think it's worth us considering for a moment. So suppose you gave me this argument. Slow processes are consequentialist. Slow is better than fast, therefore consequentialism is true. I think this is quite tempting if you've read Green, although I don't think it's in Green. Now, on the face of it, there's a problem here, which is slow is better than fast. I'm pretty sure Green says this somewhere, but I couldn't find it today, which is odd because I've had it before. Anyway, it's certainly true. It's not true that slow is better than fast. That I think is untrue. They are in some ways complementary. What we should expect is that the fast processes will be highly accurate in familiar situations, and it would take an awful lot of confidence in some kind of reasoned judgment to go against those fast processes. For comparison, your physical cognition is telling you one thing, and you are in a familiar situation, you should be extremely dubious about a conclusion that you've inferred from a physical theory that contradicts that, right? It should be like triple checking, and even then you might want to hold back. So it's not true in general that slow is better than fast. We could, though, modify this, and we could say, look, well, in cases where there is disagreement, as Green argued, disagreement is a marker that we're likely to be in an unfamiliar situation. Why is that? Well, if our fast processes are all working, and if we assume some broad form of moral realism, that just our ethical truths and our fast processes are tracking those, then disagreement is a sign that our fast processes are coming apart here. They're giving us different readings, and so one or another of the fast processes, yours or mine, has gone wrong, so says Green, and so we're probably not in a familiar situation. Certainly we're not in a situation where we should trust those fast processes. Now, of course, you may want to reject the idea here of moral realism, but in that case, you're unlikely to be persuaded by any of this argument anyway. So I'm going to put that aside. So I'm going to say, look, with that modification, I think this premise is okay. This premise is okay. So now should we accept the argument? Well, not quite. You'll know earlier, if you've looked at the section on the auxiliary hypothesis to the dual process theory, that we should not accept that slow processes are consequentialist. That was the point of the argument about the auxiliary hypotheses. We could make that hypothesis, but there is a much weaker hypothesis which is no less well supported by evidence. That weaker hypothesis just says slow processes differ from fast processes in that sometimes your slow processes take into account in a way which is flexible consequences, no matter how far removed they are via means and end from an action. That's very far from saying that the slow processes are consequentialist. So it seems to me that this argument has no way to work at all. So we're looking for an argument which will provide us with positive support for consequentialism. What I've just suggested is that that argument, there it is, doesn't work, right? Because it has a false premise. All right, but is there an alternative? Try this one. Here's another try. Most, if not all, of act consequentialism's competition relies on premises that are not justified inferentially. That's what Green says. I don't know if that's true. Consequentialism does not rely on any such premises. Sorry, that should be act consequentialism. Therefore, act consequentialism is true. Well, okay, so if you thought that the premises were true here, should you accept the conclusion? Should you accept the conclusion? I think that depends on how you feel about the only game in town type arguments. So in effect, I think what the argument establishes, if anything, is that the only viable theory that philosophers have so far come up with is act consequentialism, if the argument works. For what it's worth, I'm not impressed by the only game in town argument, because I'm quite open to the possibility that none of the very general ethical theories that philosophers have offered are particularly good, that philosophers are just mistaken about large bits of ethics generally. So the fact that something is the only game in town when the philosophers are playing doesn't give me any confidence at all that I want to be playing that game, so to speak. What's my point here? Serious point. If you want to use this argument, I think you've got quite a bit of work to do. All right, so here I think it's quite hard to see how we could get an argument for a particular ethical theory from our reconstruction of Green's argument. We gave a loose reconstruction, which is somewhat weaker than the argument Green himself offers. That, I think, gives our argument a better chance of establishing its conclusion at the cost of providing no clear way of giving positive support for a particular ethical theory. But I'm putting this in orange, not red, because all I've done is looked at a couple of cases and said, can't work there. Over to you. You're the philosopher in the room. Can you provide positive case for a particular ethical theory on the basis of a reconstruction of Green's argument? I don't know, maybe. All right, now, what about the negative part? Maybe what the reconstruction of Green's argument is really useful for is actually removing some objections which have held one or another person back from accepting consequentialism. And indeed, this is Singer's idea. He says, the chief weapons of opponents of utilitarianism have been examples intending to show that the dictates of utilitarianism clash with moral intuitions that we all share. And he goes on and gives several examples with references, some quite good examples from Williams and others. And what Singer says, I think rightly, is that now we have Green's discovery, we should no longer accept these examples. Why is that? Well, look at a particular case. So here's an argument against consequentialism. Many people spontaneously judge that we should not drop. What am I talking about here? Here's the dilemma. If you remember, what's happening is there's an empty boxcar rolling along, and there's a person who I think is on a footbridge, and if Mary pulls a lever, that person will fall down, stop the boxcar, saving the lives of 5 people who would otherwise certainly die, but killing the person who's dropped down into the path of the boxcar. So many people judge, no, you can't do this. And this is regarded as comparable to the transplant case, where the surgeon has an opportunity to cut up a healthy person in order to save 5 patients. Again, many people think, just shouldn't do that. And I believe that the law says you shouldn't do that as well. So there's a good reason to think that might be wrong. So that, of course, is potentially an argument against consequentialism, or rather, it gives us an argument against some form of consequentialism. But how does that argument go? Well, first of all, we have to draw a conclusion. We have to say, from those spontaneous judgments, we should not drop. So I would regard this as a premise which is either not justified inferentially, in which case we shouldn't accept it, or is justified by appeal to the way that people ordinarily make judgments. But since I've put consequentialism star here, this is right. So there is a form of consequentialism, not all forms. There is a form of consequentialism which implies that we should drop. That's true. And we can conclude, therefore, that that form of consequentialism is wrong. So I take it that what we have here is a valid argument once we've got this premise in place, but that Green's argument gives us good reason to reject the inference from what people ordinarily judge to the premise we should not drop. So here's the idea. The inference fails because the fact that people make this judgment doesn't give us any reason to think that it's true, because the judgment is probably indirectly a consequence of the way that fast processes operate, giving rise to a kind of sense that there's something wrong here. But since the situation is likely to be an unfamiliar situation, because it's of interest to philosophers as a sort of edge case, we can't suppose that those fast processes are reliable in this case. It's an unfamiliar situation. Alternatively, we don't give the justification at all. We take a Cam-style route here and we just say we should not drop. That's a not justified inferentially premise. But once again, the Green argument gives us reason not to accept not justified inferentially premises about particular conclusions. So either way, you can't have this premise, and so the objection to consequentialism is taken away. So here, I think, the loose reconstruction of Green's argument provides us with straightforward negative defense of consequentialism. That's to say that Green's reconstruction does succeed in removing some of the objections to consequentialism. So that's minimally a success for that argument.